Okay, question for Eric. What are the best ways to do concurrent cardio, so low intensity training or high intensity training, along with lifting?
Yeah, so I've got a brief anecdote about this. I was in Finland and I was talking about bodybuilding contest preparation from a research perspective. And I didn't really study up on the event too much before I went there. I knew what I was going to do. I knew the general context, and I was like, perfect. And I got there the first day, and I was like, I probably should have considered the fact that Professor Hakkinen was there, as was Juha Atienen. And so, like, most of the really good concurrent training research for the last, like, ever basically came out of their lab. And I was like, oh God, I have some slides on concurrent training. I was like, this is not my bread and butter. Like, but it seemed prudent when you're talking about bodybuilders who are lifting and doing a ton of cardio a lot of times. So I was really, really scared because they were in the audience. I was like, I hope they agree with me, because if not, then I'm clearly wrong. Like, I'm not going to argue with them. But in any case, as I presented my slides, they smiled and nodded the whole time, so that was a good sign. Someone else at the event also did a talk specifically about concurrent training, and all of our general recommendations lined up quite well. So I walked away feeling very good about myself. Now, when it comes to concurrent training, there's a really nice review by an author. The last name is... It's gonna sound like a disease when I say this. That's clearly not how you pronounce it. To me, it looks like methanitis.
That's how it looks to me, too.
Okay. But it came out in 2018. Very nice review. Talking about concurrent training. Obviously, there is some potential to experience an interference effect. And that is, if you're doing a ton of aerobic training and a ton of resistance training, the signaling pathways that precede adaptations in the muscle to each of these types of training, they are to some extent at odds with each other. And we do see, as I kind of talked about in my presentation in Finland, nervously, when you see interventions where people are doing a ton of cardio and a ton of lifting, you do tend to see an interference effect present. But when they start getting a little bit more careful about the overall volume of both, those are the interventions where you really don't see much of a pronounced interference effect. And so there are things you can do when it comes to intensity, volume, and timing that very much reduce the likelihood of a significant interference effect.
Can I just throw one thing in here?
Yes.
So most people listening to this are probably either primarily have hypertrophy or strength goals. The other aspect of the interference effect that's not talked about quite as often is the impact of concurrent training versus resistance training alone on power output, or like high velocity stuff. And the literature, as far as like strength and hypertrophy goes, does show that, yeah, you can mess with some of these variables and either negate the interference effect or at least minimize it pretty substantially. The stuff on power output is a little bit more dire. The interference effect is larger. It shows
much
up
larger.
Way larger.
Yeah.
It shows up in more contexts, etc. So like if you're just trying to build big legs or improve your squat and you want to do some cardio, like, you'll probably be fine. If you take the advice that Eric's about to give. But if you're trying to put 4 inches on your vertical, probably not the best idea.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's pretty wild when you see the drop in power in some of those studies with the interference effect, or just the lack of power adaptations that take place. Power is usually more affected than strength, and strength is usually a little more affected than hypertrophy, generally speaking. So I'm of the opinion that hypertrophy is the only thing that actually matters. And so that's why my answer is written from that perspective. So with all these things, power is tricky, but if you really want to include cardio and you really want to avoid the interference effect, the first thing you want to do is be really cautious about how much of both you're doing. And so like the thing I brought up in my slides about physique athletes is like, you'll see competitors in case studies and it's like they were lifting 90 minutes a day, 6 days a week, and they were doing at least 4 hours of cardio a week. That's a lot. And oh, by the way, they're also eating at an enormous deficit. Like, they're interfering all over the place, but that's kind of the nature of the game. But something that you can do is try to, limit the number of times per week that you're doing what I would call a real aerobic bout of exercise. If you're taking a 30-minute walk just to get your energy expenditure up, I don't consider that part of the game here. We're talking about something where you're jogging or more in terms of intensity, in my opinion, or, getting on the bike and doing some real dedicated pedaling. A walk around the neighborhood, I think you could probably do that to your heart's content, assuming it's not an outrageous number of hours you're spending doing that per day. You're probably not going to interfere with much at all, in my opinion. Now, I would say the more you can limit your cardio sessions, certainly the more you can limit the interference effect. The tricky thing is, a lot of times people will say, try to prefer high intensity intervals rather than, lower intensity steady state cardio. To an extent, that's okay. And the understanding there is that when we'll look at the different molecular pathways that are stimulated by high intensity interval training, they're less at odds with what we're trying to achieve with strength training when you compare it to like traditional aerobic exercise. The problem is, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, as everybody found out in about 2010, if you just do like 9 sessions of HIIT per week, you're going to die. Like, you're going to be so fatigued and tired, you're going to perform like crap. So you have to strike a balance there. Like, it's very easy to look at the molecular pathways and say, oh, we'll do the high intensity stuff. But that fails to factor in the fact that really high intensity stuff will wreck you, especially if you're lifting several times a week as well. So I think you have to strike a balance there. I usually don't like to see people doing, unless they really need to, more than 2 or 3 cardio bouts per week. And I usually don't like to see more than 1 or 2 of them be high intensity interval type workouts. But you have to get in there and work at an individual level and figure out what can we actually accommodate in terms of recovery. And you have to be really, I would err on the side of caution and say, let's get away with as minimal cardio as we can as the starting point, and work up from there and see how much you can do before you start to really interfere with just overall fatigue day to day, the ability to perform, the ability to recover. Another thing you can do is separate the training bouts out. So there's all these different studies looking at like which one goes first, right? Aerobic training or resistance training, if you're doing them at the same workout, right? So if you're going to go in the gym and do both, which you do first?
So the most recent meta-analysis on that, I forget who the author was, but there were 2 groups that published basically the same meta-analysis in the same month, just in different journals.
Yeah.
Both looking at this question. And if memory serves, the order that they were performed in didn't affect gains in aerobic performance, but doing the resistance training first was better for strength and hypertrophy.
Yeah, if you look at the interference effect literature, it'd be really ideal if you could separate those out into different sessions, I think. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times they'll say, if you can get away with it, do your resistance training and your cardio or aerobic training on separate days, kind of alternate throughout the week. But they do say at minimum, it would be nice if you're really focused on strength, power, hypertrophy gains, if you could ideally give yourself at least a good 3 to 6 hours of separation between your cardio bout and your resistance training bout. So, I mean, the more you can separate them, the better. But they tend to say at least 3 to 6 hours. If separating them is not an option and you're interested mostly in strength and hypertrophy, then you're going to do strength first, followed by the cardio bout. And then finally, one thing to keep in mind when you're balancing the overall volume and frequency of these workouts is keeping your main goal in mind. So what they recommend in this particular review, which I agree with, is if your main focus is on your resistance training adaptations, you probably shouldn't be doing 3 cardio bouts for every lifting bout you have. Like the numbers don't make sense there. So you want to do a ratio of 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 resistance training bouts to cardio bouts per week. And they say, obviously that ratio can get a lot more even if the main focus is on aerobic training. But, a lot of times you'll see people who their main focus is resistance training, but they're trying to lean out and they're doing as many cardio bouts per week as resistance training bouts. And I think that's probably going a little too far with the cardio, especially if they're pretty vigorous bouts.
Mm-hmm. If I can add one thing to this as well, so this is something that's a little bit more tentative, and I just kind of, I guess, discovered it in the literature this past month when I was writing an article for Mass. But it kind of seems that if you are doing concurrent training, that it may be a little bit more important to also make sure you're not doing your resistance training to failure. So the thing that put me onto this is there was a paper published last month by Carroll et al., where they had one group training to failure, not every set to failure, but every set pretty close to failure and the last set of every exercise to failure. And then the other group training generally about 2 to 6 reps shy of failure. Did that for 10 weeks if memory serves. And they were also doing 2 sprint training sessions per week. And by and large, what you see in the literature, if you look at like the failure versus non-failure stuff, is either more hypertrophy when training to failure or similar hypertrophy between the two conditions. In this paper, the group not training to failure had significantly larger increases in anatomical cross-sectional area of the quads and non-significant larger differences. So like kind of leaning in that direction, but p-value not quite below 0.05 for type 1 fiber cross-sectional area, type 2 fiber cross-sectional area, and vastus lateralis thickness as well. So this is really kind of the first study I've seen in that body of literature leaning really hard in favor of not training to failure. And so the interesting thing is they did have a couple cardio sessions per week in that study as well. So I went back and looked through the concurrent training literature to see the concurrent training studies where the concurrent training group actually grew more than the group only doing resistance training. And I could find 4 studies. 2 of them, it's kind of hard to parse. They were by Lundberg et al., if memory serves. And the resistance training was isokinetic stuff. So it's hard to know exactly how that would apply to just normal isotonic training. The other 2, though, one was by Kazior et al., and one was by Mikola et al. And in both of those studies, the majority of the training was not done to failure. So in the Kazior study, I want to say like 18 out of the 21 training sessions weren't to failure. And in the Mikola study, I want to say 14 out of the 21 weeks of training weren't done to failure, which is pretty cool. Like 21-week training study is pretty long for the literature. And so both of those studies saw more hypertrophy when doing concurrent training versus only resistance training. And in the Carroll paper, it saw more hypertrophy. So it was 2 concurrent training groups, but one of them wasn't training to failure, and they had more growth than the group training to failure. So that's notable because for most of the training literature that's out there, you just have people do resistance training to failure because that's a good way to, standardize stuff and make sure people are actually training hard and not just sandbagging you the whole time. And so it's something where I guess one could potentially theorize that rather than an interference effect, maybe it's slightly synergistic, doing cardio plus non-failure training. That may be a bit of a stretch, but I think what we can say with slightly more confidence than that is if you are doing concurrent training, I think it becomes even more important for your resistance training to not be done to failure. Maybe just because the added fatigue of training to failure when compounded with the extra fatigue from the concurrent training really just digs you into a bigger hole. And the other thing I'll note, which I don't think you touched on, is that when you look at the interference effect literature, it's really only for the lower body. So the studies that have looked at whether doing like, running or cycling affects hypertrophy. You see it with lower body stuff, but not upper body stuff.
Yeah.
So, if you compete in the board shorts division and you just need to look good from the waist up, probably doesn't really matter.
I think I would suspect that it doesn't matter based on the literature we have. But I would also caution people who do compete in the physique division, board shorts, not to get too attached to, like, interference effect happens on a spectrum, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly something where the dose makes the poison.
Right, yeah. So the thing that always kills me is like when people are, it's like you're, competing in something that is theoretically based on, especially if you're natural doing physique, the physique category, you're still trying to get as big as you can. Like there's nobody natural who's like, just too big. There's probably like four physique competitors out there who are like, yeah, I need to chill. But realistically, like, I mean, can we just say it? Like, physique is like, it was made for the non-tested federation, so people didn't have to have like 1 million grams of test per week.
Yeah.
Isn't that pretty much the deal that we're comfortable with?
Yeah.
So like in natural, like, you're still trying to get big. And the thing that kills me is when people are dieting hard and lifting hard and they're doing 6 hours of moderate intensity cardio per week. It's like, maybe it's not the same interference effect that we're seeing, the kind of local within the particular muscles acting, but your lifting is going to suck.
Yeah, and another thing to note is the concurrent training literature we have isn't also looking at people in big calorie deficits.
Right.
And one just fun little physiology fact for people out there is if you're in a big calorie deficit and carbs are low as well, doing lower body cardio stuff can cause glycogen depletion in your upper body via the wonders of the lactate shuttle, where basically, like, you can metabolize carbohydrate into lactate in like your arms, pecs, shoulders, whatever, and then that lactate is shuttled to your lower body, converted back into carbohydrate and used for aerobic or anaerobic metabolism. So yeah, that is a good point. In the literature, it doesn't really seem like the interference effect really hits the upper body all that much, assuming you're doing lower body dominant cardio. But yeah, it wouldn't shock me if things changed in an energy deficit, or especially if you're doing really, really high volumes of cardio.